To continue the discussion about different types of regimes, we're going to cover authoritarian regimes at this point. And then we're going to cover the types of authoritarian regimes and their sources of power. Authoritarian rule is a political regime where a small group of individuals exercises power over the state without having any kind of rule or law or playbook or rule book to follow or constitution to follow. So they're not really held responsible to the public. The leaders of the government might claim that they are listening to the people or holding themselves accountable to the people, but in actuality, there are none of the characteristics of democracy in the authoritarian regime. All right, authoritarian sources of power. The first type of source of power you can get is economic power, where a few wealthy elites control the political system. It's very similar to an oligarchy. The haves, or the business owners, or just the wealthy 1%, are going to suppress any attempt by the have-nots to try to get a leg up economically. There is not going to be an opportunity to redistribute wealth through a taxation system. The government is not going to provide services to better the lives of the have-nots. And you won't really see this economic authoritarianism in a democracy, obviously, because in a democracy, a key is that you're going to have a middle class of people. If you have a middle class of people, then you're going to have a large group of people that have a financial interest or an economic stake in the government. They're going to put more demands on the government to make policies. Generally, if you have a large economic class or middle class, you're going to have more people that have education and will participate in the system. You're going to have more people with time, time, and means to influence the political system. So if you do have a large middle class, then you are not going to find it easy for an authoritarian regime to rise up. That's why there's always concern about the growing gap between the rich and the poor and the declining middle class, is because having a healthy middle class really is a key to a civil society in a democratic regime. Something you will not find very commonly in an authoritarian regime. Social sources of power. The political culture in the country is rooted in the idea that the state is going to provide safety and security. This is very common in Russia. I've been saying it for quite some time in class, that the political culture of Russia just doesn't, it's just not conducive to democracy. The people in Russia really find comfort in the fact that the government is going to provide all forms of security, whether it is national security, police order, and in financial security, or just making sure that the people's the people within Russia are just taken care of. It may not be the highest level of quality of services, but it's just really been a part of the political culture and the mindset for centuries in Russia, for the people to rely on the state. That is called statism. Okay, so when the citizens rely on the state to provide most forms of security. And then you have religious source of power, and that's where state institutions are really run by the people who have climbed up the religious ladder. Think about Vatican City. Vatican City, where the Pope lives. Obviously, it's a theocracy. The Pope is the head of the city, and those who help run the Vatican are the higher ups within the Catholic Church. Also very common in Islamic states. So Islamic states and Catholic states you're going to find more rule by religion or a theocracy. And that just kind of makes sense, because if you remember the origins of Protestant religion, it was a protest against the authoritarian rule of the kings and the connection between the Catholic Church, and questioning like institutional authority and that idea that somebody else knows what's best for you, so you should just blindly follow them. Okay. All right, authoritarian means of control. Coercion. I think coercion is the first thing that we think about when we think of authoritarian regimes. Um, that they're just going to use brute force, the security forces, the police, like a police state, martial law, surveillance. If you are critiquing the government or petitioning the government to change, you will be silenced. Co-optation. Co-optation is actually something that you're familiar with from U.S. history. You just never really heard that term used. But it's the idea of bringing in individuals into the regime who may be questioning what the regime is doing, and establishing a beneficial relationship with those individuals and trying to get them to buy into the legitimacy of the country. So, in again, comparing it to the classroom, if you're a teacher and you have that kid who's acting out, you might see that the teacher tries to have them like buy into what's going in the classroom by maybe complimenting them a lot, or sending them on errands, or trying, maybe giving them some kind of treat like some candy or something to try to get them to buy into what's going on in the classroom. It's the same thing on a much bigger scale. In a state, the government will take people who maybe are contradicting the regime and try to make them a part of the government, because once they're a part of the government, they can't fight it. If they're benefiting from being a part of the government, they're going to lay off and not critique the state. So there are types of co-optation. Um, One is corporatism, and that's when the state is going to choose which groups are allowed to represent the interest of the people. So if there are students maybe that want to form an organization, the state is going to kind of create that organization and incorporate the students into that organization, and then control what happens, controls the dialogue of that group. So it'd be like if the United States made their own interest groups and controlled what was talked about in those groups. Um, the state could make a labor union and control the dialogue and the discussions within that labor union. So it's like if Mr. Roberts wanted to make, the principal wanted to make an organization, like a student organization for those students who weren't happy with school policy, he would bring y'all into the office and he would really drive the conversation and kind of make it seem like y'all had a say, but really he's the one controlling the discussion. So same thing on a national level or a state level, excuse me. All right, clientelism, you know that in U.S. history more as patronage, and that's when you give favors or contracts or services to supporters, people who support your regime, like businesses that support your regime, or wealthy people who support your regime. You give them jobs, or you hire them to do some kind of government service. So if you are a contractor who builds roads and you have a lot of employees and you're pretty powerful, you have a lot of money, if you support a state's regime, then that state will hire you to build the roads. So you benefit because you're going to make a lot of money building all of the roads in the state. So of course you're not going to contradict or critique the regime that's making you a ton of money. And so, of course, this leads to corruption, because basically what you're doing is you're buying people. And once people are bought into the system, um, people are going to do questionable things to maintain that beneficial relationship. so on and so forth. And when you look into your different countries, you'll see examples of how that's worked, especially in places like Nigeria, and Russia. Okay, and then of course you have personality cults. This is another means of control, and we've talked about this, like charismatic authority, where the leader seems to be or is portrayed as this like perfect symbol of what it means to be a part of this country. It's like they're the epitome of nationalism of the state. Totalitarian regimes. Okay. Totalitarian regimes. So now we're going to get into the different types of authoritarian regimes. So totalitarian can kind of be also known as personal rule. This is when you have a highly centralized, and what I mean by centralized is that the power is central to one point. So, like, the leader is almost like the sun of the solar system. So, you have a highly centralized regime that possesses some form of strong ideology. Okay, so for example, right here we have China. Um, the obvious strong ideology in China is the history and tradition of communism. Um, and they really are dictating what happens in the state, not only the state, but society, like political culture and the economy. It's kind of more negative than it has a more negative connotation than authoritarian, because in order to have one person really dominate the political system, it's going to be very repressive. They're going to use violence. They're going to scare people into complying. Kind of a part of that totalitarianism is one party rule. Generally, the one party, which is associated with the personality cult, is going to be the party that rules. Um, like if you think about the classic example of Hitler's Nazi Germany or Stalin Soviet Russia under the Communist Party, there are no more options. So the party of the strong personality is the party that you have to follow. An example too of one party rule, the PRI, or the Industrial Revolutionary Party in Mexico, ruled in Mexico from 1929 to 2000. They've operated a massive clientelism network, and um, they've done some they were responsible for doing some ballot box stuffing. That's why you see like the money associated with like these X's are supposed to be votes. So again, PRI is an example of that one party rule. And of course, Mexico wasn't, let me go back to this. Mexico wasn't necessarily an authoritarian, totalitarian regime, don't get me wrong. But it was, in that sense, an illiberal democracy because there wasn't competition. All right, military regimes. Military regimes are very common after a coup d'etat, where the military will overthrow the civilian rulers, and then the military will put themselves in place as the government. It's really common in states that are struggling with stability, legitimacy. There's a lot of violence, terror. If there's a lot of terror, terrorist attacks, and things like that, it's really easy for a military regime to come in because they're going to tout how they can keep the country stable. And again, once leaders are in place, they do a lot to restrict civil rights and keep political parties from forming. Really common in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The last one, real quick, is a theocracy, and this is a political system in which the political leaders are the religious leaders, and the religious law is going to provide the structure or the rule of law for the country, and that's what you would find in Iran, where you have the country is ruled by the supreme leader, which is the Ayatollah. All right, that is it for authoritarian regimes.